G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so welcome to session 27. We're going to look to this evening from chapter 35, verse 6, down to chapter 36, verse 3. Just a quick recap on what we did finished off last session. We're into this area where we're looking at the destruction of Edom in chapter 35, verses 1 to 15. And we saw the declaration of judgment back in verses 1 to 4. Ezekiel was now told to prophesy against Mount Seir. Now, remember, Mount Seir is that central mountain range in the land of the Edomites. So in the prophecy, it stands for the whole country of Edom. Now, Edom has been dealt with twice before in the context of the prophecies of judgment against the Gentile nations. So, but in this section now, Ezekiel is dealing with it again in this section. It's revisited here because the total destruction of Edom is connected with the final restoration of Israel. So during the Great Tribulation, the Jews will be in hiding in Edom, in a place called Bozrah or Petra, as we commonly know it, and the Antichrist and his armies will come against the Jews there. Now, in preparation for the final restoration, Edom is to be destroyed by Israel, according to Ezekiel 25 and Obadiah 17 to 20. Now, it's for this reason that Edom is dealt with again here, for Israel's restoration will come with the total destruction of Edom. The means of judgment will be the hand of God. Ezekiel prophesies that Edom and her cities will be a complete desolation. And the cause of the judgment is her anti-Semitism. Edom has had a perpetual enmity against Jews. In fact, she turned Jewish people over to their enemies to be killed. Now, Ezekiel specifically says that this complete desolation will happen during the time of the iniquity of the end. So that's specifically that 7-year period called the Great Tribulation, or the time of Jacob's trouble. Okay, new section tonight. We're going to continue on. Now, we looked verses 1 to 5 last session. Now, in verses 6 to 9, we're now given a very graphic description of the judgment upon the land of Edom. Therefore, as I live, says the Lord Jehovah, I'll prepare you unto blood. This is chapter 35, 6 to 9. As I'll prepare you unto blood, and blood shall pursue you. Since you have not hated blood, therefore blood shall pursue you. Thus will I make Mount Seir an astonishment and a desolation. And I'll cut off from it him that passed through and him that returns. And I will fill its mountains with its slain. In your hills and in your valleys and in all your watercourses shall they fall that are slain with the sword. I will make you a perpetual desolation, and your cities shall not be inhabited, and you shall know that I am Jehovah. So in this description, we can point out 4 things here. First of all, in verse 6, it's going to be characterized by blood. Therefore, what's this therefore? Because of what we were told previously in verse 5, as I live, saith the Lord Jehovah. Again, this phrase emphasizes the solemnity of God's oath. I will prepare you unto blood. So this underlines the violence of the death they will suffer nationally. Blood shall pursue you. There'll be no escape from this massive slaughter of the Edomites. Remember, the Edomites are descendants of Esau, a brother of Jacob. Since thou hast not hated blood. So the Edomites did not hate blood enough to avoid shedding it. They had a kind of a national bloodlust and had been guilty of shedding much blood. Therefore, because of their bloodlust, blood shall pursue you. This time, it will not be the Edomites themselves who will be shedding blood. Instead, it will be their blood which is going to be shed. Now, this is according to the rabbis, right? This is the rabbinic interpretation of this verse, is that the Edomites particularly hated the blood of sacrifices and the blood of circumcision. That's the rabbinic interpretation of this. More true to the context is the fact that they did not hate the shedding of blood sufficiently to stop shedding it. And that's the context here. Now, the second thing in this description of judgment in verse 7 is the emphasis on the totality of the destruction. Thus will I make Mount Seir an astonishment and a desolation, and I'll cut off from it him that passeth through and him that returns. Now, notice here, when the Hebrew portrays two opposites like this, the purpose here is to denote totality. The two opposites here are the one passing through and the one returning. So no one will pass through the country of the Edomites either way. And this is idiomatic Hebrew. Two opposites to denote totality. The slaughter of the Edomites is going to be complete. In fact, Obadiah verse 18, and the house of Esau will be made stubble. This is what we see in Obadiah verse 18. The house of Esau shall be made stubble. They shall burn them. This is Jacob shall burn them and consume them. And there shall be no survivor for the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken this. Now, Obadiah verse 18 tells us that when this slaughter is finished, Esau will not have a single descendant left, whereas Jacob is going to have many. The third thing in the description is the destruction of life in verse 8. And I will fill its mountains with its slain. They that are slain with the sword are going to fall on the hills, in the valleys, and along the watercourses. So this total annihilation of the Edomites is to occur finally during the Great Tribulation. And in verse 9, we have the fourth result, where we have a description of the desolation of the land of Edom. I will make you a perpetual desolation throughout the entire kingdom period. Your cities shall not be inhabited. So not only will this desolation affect the things that have been built in the land of Edom, but there's going to be a total absence of life. And the final result is, they shall know that I am Jehovah. Yeah. The following passage, verses 10 to 13, gives us a description of judgment, and Ezekiel is going to deal with the cause of this judgment. In verses 10 to 13, here we go. Because you have said, these two nations and these two countries shall be mine, and we will possess it, whereas Jehovah was there. Therefore, as I live, says the Lord Jehovah, I will do according to your anger and according to your envy, which you hast showed out of your hatred against them. And I'll make myself known among them when I shall judge you. Verse 12, and you shall know that I, Jehovah, have heard all your revilings which you have spoken against the mountains of Israel, saying, they are laid desolate, they are given us to devour. You have magnified yourselves against me with your mouth, and have multiplied your words against me. I have heard it. So in this passage, Ezekiel clearly shows why God determined such a total judgment was necessary. Verse 10 states their specific sin. They coveted the land of Israel. Because you have said, this is the cause, because they had made a specific statement, and the claim they made was, these two nations and these two countries shall be mine. Now the two nations and countries that Edom laid claim to were the nations of Judah in the south and Israel in the north. They went on to say that we will possess it. This was their sin. The Edomites decided that they were going to possess the promised land, ignoring the fact of the very next statement, whereas Jehovah was there. This is God's earth, and he can divide it up in any way he chooses and give whatever portions of the earth to whomsoever he desires. The fact is, he gave possession of the land to the Jews and to nobody else. Although their enjoyment of the land is based upon Israel's obedience and faithfulness to God, their right of possession is not based upon that, but it's based upon God's free will gift to Israel. So Edom made a claim to the land. But that ignored God's decree that this land belongs to the Jews and to no others. And because Edom coveted the promised land, which was never intended for them, we see in verse 11, the judgment was to strike. Therefore, because of their sin of covetousness in verse 10, as I live, says the Lord Jehovah, again, God emphasizes the solemnity of his oath and what he's about to say. I will do according to your anger and according to your envy or jealousy, which you have showed out of your hatred against them, that is, against the Jews. This is their sin, anti-Semitism. There was a national hatred of the descendants of the twin brother of their father. The descendants of Esau hated the descendants of Jacob. Their very anti-Semitism is what caused them to claim the promised land for themselves. So now God says in verse 11, I will make myself known among them, that is the Jews, when I shall judge you, Edom. So the them here in verse 11 is the Jews. I'll make myself known among the Jews when I shall judge Edom. So Israel will come to a real knowledge of God. They'll come to a saving knowledge of God. Now, when will this happen? At the time when he shall judge the Edomites. Excuse me. So Israel's national salvation comes at about the same time as Edom's final judgment, when they suffer the total annihilation of their population for all time. In verses 12 to 13, Edom's sins are reiterated. They can be divided up into two categories here. First, we see in verse 12, their sins against Israel. And you shall know that I, Jehovah, have heard all your revilings which you have spoken against the mountains of Israel. Edom's revilings were, they are laid desolate, they are given to us, Edom, to devour. So the sins against Israel by Edom were, first of all, over Israel's fall, was that they were wonderfully happy, they were full of glee. And secondly, their glee over the desolation of the land. And third, in their claim to possess the land for themselves. And this is the way Edom sinned against Israel in verse 12. And the second thing we see in verse 13, we have the second category of Edom's sins, which are against God himself. And you have magnified yourselves against me with your mouth. So boasting against the Jews is automatically reckoned to be boasting against God. And we need to learn this lesson well. When one magnifies himself against the Jews, it means that he's magnifying himself against God, because the Jews are God's chosen people. He goes on to say, you have multiplied your words against me. So here we see any statements against the Jews are taken and viewed by God as statements against him as well. So what does God say? He says, I have heard it. So anything spoken against the Jews is something God pays special attention to. And now we see in verses 14 to 15, we see Edom's status in the Messianic kingdom. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, when the whole earth rejoices, I will make you desolate, as you did rejoice over the inheritance of the house of Israel, because it was desolate, so will I do unto you. You shall be desolate, O Mount Seir, and all Edom, even all of it, they shall know that I am Jehovah. So these verses spell out Edom's status in the Messianic kingdom. In verse 14, while the whole earth is rejoicing, God will make Edom desolate. The entire earth will rejoice and blossom as the rose in the Messianic kingdom. It'll be tremendously beautified so that it becomes once again like the Garden of Eden. But Edom will be a perpetual desolation, a perpetual burning wasteland. And the reason for this perpetual desolation of Edom is spelled out in the first part of verse 15. The sin behind it is as you did rejoice over the inheritance of the house of Israel, because it was desolate. So Israel's inheritance was the land. And when the land was desolated, Edom rejoiced over such a catastrophe. Now, God is going to introduce the curse for curse in kind principle of the Abrahamic covenant, which we find back in Genesis 12, verse 3. He will now smack it back against the Edomites. So will I do unto you. Verse 15 now ends with a description of Edom's desolation. You shall be desolate, O Mount Seir. And to make sure there's no mistake about it, you will not simply be limited to the Seir mountain range. You will extend much further than that. And all Edom, the whole land, which today is the southern part of Jordan, it's going to undergo a massive and total destruction. He goes on to say, even all of it. By adding this little extra phrase, it makes it even more emphatic. What is described here is also described in Isaiah chapter 34, verses 8 to 15. And the result is, they shall know that I am Jehovah. The pronoun they here refers to Israel, according to what we saw back in verse 11. Now we move on to the prophecy that concerns the mountains of Israel. We're looking at chapter 36, verses 1 to 15. We're going to see the desolation of the mountains in verses 1 to 7. We're just going to do verse 1 here. Now, as he deals with the prophecy concerning the mountains of Israel in these first 15 verses, first of all, he talks about the desolation of these mountains in verses 1 to 7. In verse 1, the addressee is the mountains of Israel. And you, son of man, prophesy unto the mountains of Israel and say, ye mountains of Israel, hear the word of Jehovah. Now, back in Ezekiel chapter 6, the mountains of Israel were condemned. But in this chapter, they are going to be blessed. And we should not miss the connection between chapter 35 and chapter 36 with the contrast between the mountains of Edom and the mountains of Israel. According to chapter 35, verse 15, Mount Seir, Edom, is to suffer a total and perpetual desolation. But by contrast, in this chapter 36, the mountains of Israel are to be restored. The mountains of Israel here stands for the whole land of Israel, just as Mount Seir stood for the whole land of Edom. Now, verse 2 and 3. In verse 2 and 3, he spells out the deeds of Israel's enemy. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, because the enemy has said against you, aha, and the ancient high places are ours in possession. Therefore prophesy and say, thus says the Lord Jehovah, because they have made you desolate and swallowed you up on every side, that you might be a possession unto the residue of the nations, and you are taken up in the lips of talkers, the evil report of the people. So here, in verse 2, we have the enemy's claims brought in once again. Because the enemy has said against you, aha, and the ancient high places are ours in possession. This is Edom. Edom is saying the mountains of Israel are ours. We're going to possess them. And this was Edom's claim back in verse 10 of chapter 35. So here the first offense committed by the enemy is they claimed possession of the land. And then in verse 3, he deals with the enemy's crime. Therefore prophesy, because of verse 2. And this word therefore will be used 5 times in this little section. Because, even because. Again, this is very emphatic, as this doubling shows. Because they have made you desolate and swallowed you up on every side, for the purpose that you might be a possession unto the residue of the nations. Now, Through their enemies' actions, Israel had become a focus of ridicule for the Gentile nations. You are taken up in the lips of talkers and the evil report of the people. This is the second offense of Israel's enemies. They have been guilty of so desolating the land that the Jews have become a laughing stock. And this verse also contains the third offense, defamation of the land. There are three offenses then we see here. First of all, they're claiming possession of the land. Second, desolating the land so that the Jews were ridiculed over it. And third, defaming the land. Now, in verses 4 to 7, we're now told God's response. Therefore, ye mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord Jehovah. Thus says the Lord Jehovah to the mountains and to the hills, to the watercourses and to the valleys, to the desolate places, to the desolate wastes, and to the cities that are forsaken, which are become a prey and derision to the residue of the nations that are round about. Verse 5, therefore thus says the Lord Jehovah, surely in the fire of my jealousy have I spoken against the residue of the nations, and against all Edom, that have appointed my land unto themselves for a possession, with the joy of all their heart, with despite of soul, to cast it out for a prey. Verse 6, therefore, prophesy concerning the land of Israel, and say unto the mountains and to the hills, the watercourses and to the valleys, thus says the Lord Jehovah, behold, I have spoken in my jealousy and in my wrath, because you have borne the shame of the nations. Therefore, thus says the Lord Jehovah, I have sworn, saying, surely the nations that are round about you, they shall bear their shame. Okay. So in verse 4, a message comes to the land of Israel. Therefore, because of verse 3, ye mountains of Israel, there we have the addressee again. He's talking to the mountains of Israel, which is the land of Israel. Hear the word of Jehovah. To the mountains, the hills, the watercourses, valleys, desolate wastes, cities that are forsaken. This is the description of the totality of the land. A derision to the residue of the nations that are round about. Israel had been made a laughing stock. They needed to hear the word of Jehovah now, because this word will contain the verdict of God against those three offenses committed by the enemy. The purpose of the message to the land of Israel in verse 4 is so we can understand the jealousy of God in verse 5. Therefore, this is the third time this word has been used in this section. Because of verse 4, surely in the fire of my jealousy have I spoken against the residue of the nations. So here, he speaks of the Gentile nations in general. What he's saying here is a summary of what we saw back in chapters 25 to 32, which was a judgment against the Gentile nations. He goes on to say, and against all Edom. This is now Edom in particular, and this is a summary of chapter 35. So when he says against the residue of the nations, he's speaking of the Gentile nations in general, and summarizing chapters 25 to 32. When he says, and against all Edom, meaning Edom in particular, then he's summarizing chapter 35. Now their sin in verse 5 is, they have appointed my land unto themselves for a possession, with the joy of all their heart and with despite of soul. Notice the emphasis here. They have appointed my land. My land. Israel is God's land, and therefore he can give it to whomsoever he wills. He chose to give it to the Jewish people, and so it is therefore rightfully theirs. Others who lay claim to it are going to receive the wrath of God. Now, having said this, what he has done here is simply to review the offenses that were already covered back in chapter 35. And in verses 6 to 7, we have the exchange of shame. Now, verse 6 talks about the shame of Israel, which is to be exchanged in verse 7 for the shame of the nations. In verse 6 is the shame of Israel. Therefore, this is the fourth time this word is used in this segment. Because of verse 5, where the enemy is claiming the land as their own possession, with joy of heart and despite of soul, prophesy, this is Ezekiel, prophesy concerning the land of Israel. If this prophecy goes out concerning the land of Israel, then it concerns all facets of the land, mountains, hills, watercourses, valleys. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, behold, I have spoken in my jealousy and in my wrath. Now, jealousy emphasizes the right of possession, which has now been violated. Jealousy can be used in both a good and a bad sense. In the good sense, it is merely exercising the right of possession which has been violated. And when these enemies claimed the land of Israel, which was God's land, which he gave to the Jewish people, they have violated God's right of exclusive possession. And by so doing, they have now aroused the jealousy of God, which in turn will now move him to wrath. Because you have borne the shame of the nations. And in that one statement, we discover that Israel has fulfilled what was predicted of her in chapters 1 to 24, where God says she was to bear the shame of the nations. But now, in this period of time that we're talking about here, the period of Israel's shame is now over. So in verse 7, the shame that Israel has experienced will now be exchanged to the shame with the nations. And in verse 7, therefore, the fifth time this word is used because of verse 6, therefore, because of verse 6, where Israel has borne the shame of the nations, I have sworn. Hebrew expression, which the English phrase translates, literally reads, I have lifted up my hand. So this emphasizes an extremely solemn oath. Surely the nations that are round about you, they shall bear their shame. So instead of Israel, they are now to bear the shame. In the closing days of the tribulation, it's going to be the Gentile nations who will find themselves desolated. The picture in these 7 verses, which have been talking about the desolation of the mountains of Israel, which came about because God punished Israel, is that Israel's enemies claimed that they were now the possessors of the land and they violated God's exclusive right of possession. And this created the jealousy of God, which then moved on to the wrath of God. And it is this wrath of God which will cause the exchange of shame from Israel to the Gentiles during the Great Tribulation, when they will be desolated, not Israel. Now in verses 8 to 15, we see the blessings of the mountains. And he now considers the other side of the coin, so the blessings of the mountains of Israel in verses 8 to 15. But ye, O mountains of Israel, ye shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel, for they are at hand to come. For behold, I am for you, and I will turn unto you, and you shall be tilled and sown, and I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, even all of it. And the cities shall be inhabited, the waste places shall be built. Verse 11. I'll multiply upon you man and beast, and they shall increase and be fruitful. And I'll cause you to be inhabited after your former estate, and will do better unto you than at your beginnings. You shall know that I am Jehovah. Yea, verse 12, yea, I will cause men to walk upon you, even my people Israel, and they shall possess you, and you shall be their inheritance. You shall no more henceforth bereave them of children. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, because they say unto you, your land are a devourer of men, and have been a bereaver of your nation. Therefore you shall devour men no more, neither bereave your nation any more, saith the Lord Jehovah. Verse 15, neither will I let you hear any more the shame of the nations, neither shall you bear the reproach of the peoples any more, neither shall you cause your nation to stumble any more, saith the Lord Jehovah. Now, in this passage, he deals with the blessings of the mountains, concerning which, in verse 8, he considers their future fruitfulness. And this passage begins with the word but. Now, but means it's in contrast to what was just spoken about before. So in contrast to the desolation in verses 1 to 7, he now deals with the blessing of the mountains in verses 8 to 16. But ye, O mountains of Israel, you shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel. So Israel is referred to here as my people, because Israel is God's people. And now his people are being pictured as being back in the land and no longer outside the land in the diaspora. The point of this verse is to emphasize the land will once again become productive. And as we shall see, the key phrase from here on is going to be, I will. God makes many unconditional promises about what Israel's future is going to hold. Verses 9 to 11, he spells out certain blessings upon the land. In verse 9, for behold, I am for you. You shall be tilled and sown. So God is now on Israel's side, in contrast to the against thee of Edom in chapter 35, verse 3. And I will turn unto you. So God will turn again to Israel as a mark of his grace, and the land will be tilled and sown. And following this preparatory activity, in verse 10 to 11, there will come the habitation of the land. And concerning this, Ezekiel points out two things. First, in verse 10, there'll be the habitation of humanity. I will multiply men upon you. Now, Hebrew word Adam is used for men here, as it was back in chapter 34, verse 31. 34, verse 31. So all the house of Israel will be reckoned as being one Adam or one man or one great body of people, as one nation under God, even all of it, he says. So this means that every Jew will be brought back into the land, and the cities shall be inhabited, and the waste places shall be builded. So first of all, Israel is going to be inhabited by masses of Jewish humanity. Second, in verse 11, there'll be multiplication of life. I will multiply upon you man and beast, and they shall increase and be fruitful. I will cause you to be inhabited after your former estate. This means that just as the land was heavily populated before the Babylonian deportations, so it will be again. And I'll do better unto you that at your beginnings. The result will be, you shall know that I am Jehovah. So just as verse 10 emphasized the human habitation of the land by Jewish people once the kingdom is established, so throughout the kingdom there's going to be the multiplication of life, both human and animal life. Then in verse 12, he then emphasizes Israel's possession of the land. Yea, I will cause men to walk upon you, even my people Israel. So again, here the emphasis is laid upon the term men, which underlines the fact that these men are Jewish men. And the ownership of the land is made clear by the next two statements. And they shall possess you, and you shall be their inheritance. So on the one hand, the Jews will possess the land, but on the other hand, the land becomes the inheritance of the Jews. Both sides of the picture are stated to emphasize that ownership of the land will be clearly enjoyed by Israel in that day. And you shall no more henceforth bereave them of children. The land of Israel had developed a reputation for destroying its residents, but this simply will no longer be true. And the fact that Ezekiel is speaking of a time when Israel will inhabit the land, never again to be vomited out of it. And this shows that this is speaking of that final end-time restoration. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, because they say unto you, you land are a devourer of men, and have been a bereaver of your nations. Therefore you shall devour men no more, neither bereave your nation any more, says the Lord Jehovah. So in verses 13 to 15, he deals with the removal of the reproach. In verse 13, we have the accusation. Because they say unto you, So this is a second accusation along with what we saw back in verse 2 of chapter 36. So what Israel's enemies say about the land is, you are a devourer of men and have been a bereaver of your nation. So let's look at these two statements. Let's break them down. First of all, you're a devourer of men. Second, and have been a bereaver of your nation. Now, the history of those people living in the land always culminated with them being ousted eventually. So in dealing with the first phrase, you're a devourer of men, the Canaanites were there. Eventually they were thrown out. When the Philistines were there, they were ousted. Arabs were there in the past. They're there again today. They have been and will also be ousted. Babylonians, Medo-Persians, Greeks, Romans were all there, and they all were ousted. The Turks and the British were there, not any longer. So first of all, this land has had the reputation of being a devourer of men. But secondly, the land has been a bereaver of your nation. Now, the land's nation is a Jewish nation, and even they have suffered deportation and dispersion out of it. So the land itself has developed this historical reputation of being a devourer of men in general, but a bereaver of the nation of Israel in particular. Sorry, guys, can't get rid of this cough. Now, because of what Israel's enemies are saying about the land and its reputation, in verses 14 to 15, we have God's response to all of this. You shall devour men no more, neither bereave your nation anymore, says the Lord Jehovah. And in verse 14, God emphasizes that a change is going to take place. Therefore, this is the sixth time the word is found. That is, because of the reputation of verse 13, you shall devour men no more, neither bereave your nation anymore. This claim of the enemy is going to be disproved in the future. The way it's going to be done is brought out in verse 15, as Ezekiel describes three things that will never happen again. First, neither will I let them hear any more the shame of the nations. Second, neither shall you bear the reproach of the peoples anymore. And then third, neither shall you cause your nation to stumble anymore. Quick drink. According to the first statement, Israel, which is neither will I let them hear anymore, Israel will no longer have to hear any anti-Semitic abuse. In the second statement concerning the land, it will no longer have to bear this false reputation it has developed. The third statement, your nation, means Israel. The point of this entire section becomes the fact that the land belongs to Israel and Israel belongs to the land. Therefore, any other group that claims possession of the land, as the modern Palestinians are trying to do today, they're going to suffer the jealousy of God, which in turn will lead to his wrath. Now we're into the section now looking at Israel's restoration to the land in chapter 36, verses 16 to 38, 32, 30, 38. We're going to see the dispersion of Israel in verses 16 to 21. Moreover, the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, Son of man, when the house of Israel dwelt in their own land, they defiled it by their way and by their doings. Their way before me was as the uncleanness of a woman in her impurity. Wherefore I poured out my wrath upon them for the blood which they had poured out upon the land, and because they had defiled it with their idols. Verse 19. And I scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed through the countries. According to their way and according to their doings, I judged them. And when they came unto the nations whither they went, they profaned my holy name, in that men said of them, These are the people of Jehovah, and are gone forth out of his land. But I had regard for my holy name, which the house of Israel had profaned among the nations whither they went. Okay. So in dealing with Israel's restoration to the land, The first point he wants to deal with is why the dispersion became necessary and what happened in the dispersion that now makes the restoration necessary. So in verse 16, word of Jehovah comes again to Ezekiel, and in verse 17, he spells out the cause of their dispersion, and that was the sins of Israel. Son of man, when Israel dwelt in their own land, they defiled it. When Israel lived in the land, they defiled it. How? They defiled it in two ways. First, by their way, and this is by their characteristic internal corruption, and second, by their doings, because their inward characteristic of corruption manifested itself in specific sinful deeds. So what happened inside played itself out in what they did. And their way before me was as the uncleanness of a woman in her impurity. Israel was reckoned to be unclean as a woman is during her menstrual cycle in accordance with the Mosaic law. Israel was guilty of two key violations of the law, Mosaic law. They were murder and idolatry, shedding of blood and idolatry. Now, it was these sins of Israel that brought about their punishment in verses 18 to 19. In verse 18, the sins of Israel provoked the wrath of God. Wherefore? Wherefore? That's because of verse 17. Wherefore I poured out my wrath upon them. So Israel suffered the wrath of God for two reasons: murder and idolatry. The murder led to innocent blood being poured out upon this holy land, and their idolatry caused the defiling of the land. So, for the blood which they had poured out upon the land, which was the murder, and because they had defiled it with their idols, idolatry, the wrath of God was now provoked. And that in turn created the punishment in verse 19, which was the removal of the Jewish people from the land. Ezekiel describes their removal in two statements. First, I scattered them among the nations. And second, they were dispersed through the countries. So their dispersion became necessary because of their sins. And the verse now ends with a clear statement of the judgment of God. I judged them. They were judged according to their way, their inward corruption, and according to their doings, their external corruption. And all of this was strictly in accordance with the terms of the land covenant or the Palestinian covenant found in Deuteronomy chapters 29 and 30, which also spelled out, among many other things, that Israel's sins and their corruption and defilement of the land would result in their dispersion and scattering out of the land. Now, having told us the reasons for Israel's dispersion and showing that it was because of their corruption of the Holy Land, in verses 20 and 21, he begins to tell us of the necessity for their restoration. And this necessity arose out of their experience in the diaspora, the dispersion. And we need to take note of two things they experienced in their dispersion that made their restoration necessary. In verse 20, it was because God's name was profaned. It's verse 20 says, when they came unto the nations and whither they went, they profaned my holy name. So in their dispersion, God says Israel was guilty of profaning his name. But how did they do that? It was by the reaction of the Gentiles among whom they went, in that men said of them. This is how it happened. The Gentiles made a comment about their situation which profaned the holy name of God. And it goes like this. This is the verse. These are the people of Jehovah, and are gone forth out of his land. So the Gentiles, they recognized that Israel was Jehovah's nation, and that the land they had left was his land. So by virtue of their dispersion, Israel profaned God's holy name, because they made it appear that Jehovah their God was too weak when it came to protecting his own people. Now, of course, as they adopted this false notion, God's name was profaned. Now, this was not an unusual problem confined only to the prophet Ezekiel, because it was also spoken of back in Numbers chapter 14, verse 16, and Jeremiah 33, verse 24. Now, because God's name was profaned by the way the Gentiles misinterpreted the dispersion, now in verse 21 we see God's reaction. But I had regard for my holy name, which the house of Israel had profaned among the nations whither they went. So God can only tolerate this misinterpretation by the Gentiles about his name and power for only so long. God has regard or respect for his own name. And so, to defend his name, God must intervene. And what he'll do in his intervention is going to be spelled out in verses 22 to 31. In this smaller unit in Israel's restoration to the land, Ezekiel first had to speak about the dispersion of Israel, pointing out two necessities. First, the necessity for the dispersion in the first place, which is a result of Israel's pollution of the land with murder and idolatry. And second, the necessity for the restoration was a result of Gentile misinterpretation of the reason for Israel's dispersion and assigning it to God's weakness. So now we look at the process of Israel's restoration from verse 22 down to verse 31. We see the sanctification of God's name in these two verses here, verse 22 and 23. Therefore, say unto the house of Israel, thus says the Lord Jehovah, I do not this for your sake, O house of Israel, but for my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations whither you went. And I will sanctify my great name, which hath been profaned among the nations, which you have profaned in the midst of them. And the nations shall know that I am Jehovah, says the Lord Jehovah, when I shall be sanctified in you before their eyes. Now, in dealing with this process of Israel's restoration, he first of all deals with the basis for it in these two verses, which is a sanctification of God's name. In verse 22, he makes that the divine basis for Israel's redemption. Therefore, because of verses 20 to 21, say unto the house of Israel, give this message to Israel and make it clear that I do not this for your sake, O house of Israel. So the divine basis for Israel's redemption is not because Israel deserves to be redeemed. Rather, it is for my holy name, because God has regard and respect for his holy name. He's going to bring about their redemption, but for my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations whither you went. So the divine purpose for Israel's restoration is going to be the vindication of God's name. In verse 22, having dealt with the divine basis for their redemption, in verse 23, he deals with the divine purpose of it. I will sanctify my great name. Now, to sanctify means to be set apart, and God is indeed going to be set apart by what he's about to do. And I will sanctify my great name, which has been profaned among the nations. So at this point, God is going to make an indirect and a direct accusation against Israel. The indirect accusation is, my great name, which has been profaned among the nations. Indirectly, God's name had been profaned on the basis of Gentile misinterpretation of why Israel was dispersed. And then he makes a direct accusation, which you have profaned in the midst of them. So the results are, the nations shall know that I am Jehovah, and the timing is when I shall be sanctified in you before their eyes. So in dealing with the process of Israel's restoration, he first spells out in verses 22 and 23 the basic reason why Israel is to be restored is not because they deserve to be restored, but because God intends to thoroughly vindicate his holy name. Now, having said this, in verses 24 and 28, he'll talk about the specific steps to Israel's restoration, and we'll see that next week. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.